Hey, everybody, welcome back to another conversation around the 7 trust languages for a better workplace. My name is Minda Hartz, and I'm so glad that you're here. We are on our third day of digging deeper into the trust languages. There are 7. Today, we're going to dig into acknowledgement. I don't know if any of you care about being recognized for a job well done. I know I am. It's actually my primary trust language, and just curious to hear for those who've had a chance to work their way through the book, what are you finding that some of the trust languages that you're resonating with? And we are streaming live on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. And so we're just happy that you're here. If you're here live or you're going to watch after, on Monday, we talked about follow through. On Tuesday, we talked about demonstration. And today, again, we're talking about acknowledgement. And I'm so excited to have my dear friend with me today. I've known Deepa. I would say we are LinkedIn and social media friends first. And then we have helped each other in different ways and been super supportive. I just want to acknowledge Deepa. Well, first, I'm going to bring her to the stage. She's an award-winning speaker and author and a good friend of mine. So thank you, Deepa, for saying yes to me for being on the show.
Of course. I was saying, you ask and I will be here. And I agree. We've been in each other's journeys for over 5 years, and you have been so gracious and said yes right away. And I think we both have, but it's felt very authentic and amazing and easy. So
yes, no. Well, before we get into your bio, I just want to acknowledge you because for those who may not know, I had a fur baby named Boston, and he was in my life for 9.5 years. And I'm going to try not to get emotional when I have to say this, but Boston had been with me through all my books up until this point, and it was really important for me to finish as much as I could of Talk to Me Nice before he passed away unexpectedly. And when I was going through his unexpected health decline, Deepa was one of the people that were just there for me and checking on me, and it made such a difference because I was in crisis and feeling so many different emotions, and you made it easier for such a hard time, during my life. So thank you for being there for me in several ways, but I want to acknowledge that because a lot of people will say one thing but you demonstrated your friendship in a way that you didn't have to. And it definitely on those days when I was like, I didn't know if today was the last day I'd have him or not, but you were always checking in on me. And I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Of course. Thank you. I mean, I have 4 fur babies myself, so, I understand, but I also think, it speaks, Minda, to me, like our relationship, our friendship started on, LinkedIn. I think I cold reached out to you when I heard about your book, and I said, I'm kind of doing something similar. I'm a little bit behind you. And you were so gracious. You could have said, we don't need any more, but you didn't. And I think it's also a testament to, you can meet someone on social media and we've become like life friends, right?
Yes,
and we don't get to see each other all that often, even though we're both in LA because we travel a lot. But I think it speaks to that. And I think we sometimes miss that, or lose that. Like, you can meet people and they can become part of your life, even if they're through a work connection, since we're here on LinkedIn, just to mention that. So, yeah.
Yes, thank you for that. And I dedicated the book to Boston. And so it was also special. He passed away the day before I turned in my first draft. So I just made it under the gun. And so fun fact for everybody. But Deepa, for those who may not be following you on the platforms, you have a book out there, you have resources for women. Tell people a little bit more about you in your own words.
Sure. I spent over 21 years in corporate. I was a partner at Deloitte. I was there for a very long time. I led the Women's Initiative. So this work around advancing women has always been close to my heart. I worked in tech and telecom for many years. And then I left the firm like in the early stages of COVID without 100% clarity on what I was going to do. I was starting to get sick, like lots of big questions about what I wanted to do with my life. And I ended up writing a book, The First, the Few, the Only, which is kind of kindred to the work that you do. And I do a lot of speaking, as you said. I do a lot of research. I'm an executive fellow at Harvard Business School. And so I do a lot of research on advancing women. So I feel like my work in the world now is to really raise awareness on the fact that, there's more work to be done so that we can get to equity and parity and all the conversations. And that, especially in this moment, it feels really important.
It is very important. I have your book behind me. You can't see it. It's on the other side of me, but it's a book that everyone should have in their toolkit. And it was a timely book when it came out, but I think it's even more timely now with so much going on in the workplace as it relates to women and the lack of acknowledgement or being seen, right? So I think that's really important. And I want to start there. How do you define acknowledgement in terms of what does that look like for you? And maybe was there a time in your career where you appreciated it and that helped build trust or credibility with someone on the other side, or maybe where you were looking for it and you didn't receive it and that made trust erode? I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for a lot of us, acknowledgement is hard. I am not good at asking for it. I know I need it. So I'm the first one to say I need it. And maybe even more so than others, because I think especially when you aren't only or a first, right? You tend to maybe need it more because you're not really sure that you fit in or you belong, or your way of being is sometimes different. And so that acknowledgement can be really helpful. So I didn't always know how to go and get it. So for me, it's been sort of a little bit of a growing into what works for me, because asking for acknowledgement or like saying I know how to do everything and pounding the table, that's not my style. That's not who I am. That felt very hard to do. And so for a lot of my career, it became emails. I always knew I liked to write. I didn't know I was going to write a book, but I write these long emails to my leadership and just explain not what I did, but how the project was doing or how everyone on my team was contributing. And by giving recognition to them, inevitably it would come back to me and like the leadership, and there would be a lot that would happen in that way. So I think one thing I want to say is acknowledgement doesn't have to be you raise your hand, you ask for it, you get it, or just automatically get it. There are different ways of navigating, especially if that's not comfortable to you. But Minda, I just told a story, I think it was on Instagram, to be honest with you, just this week about acknowledgement, where I was, early in my career. And a senior partner kind of said to me, I don't have enough dollars and I have limited amount of titles so to the next level to become manager. You've done really great work. Which one do you want? Do you want, the pay bump, or do you want the title bump? But I can't do both because I have to allocate this limited amount of each to the whole, to the whole group. And I think it was a Friday afternoon when I walked into his office and he said that to me. And for whatever reason, I had enough gumption to say, I don't really like that choice. His name was Jerry. I don't really like that choice. That doesn't sit well with me. Like, why do I have to pick one or the other? Because I'm going to have more work to do. I want the commensurate money. And I said, I'm going to think about it for the weekend, but I really think I want both. I remember going back in Monday and saying, like, I don't like either of the choices that you're giving me. So we have to find a way to do both. And long story short, I ended up getting both. And he ended up becoming one of my biggest sponsors. And I think there was something in that dance of asking for what I wanted in a very authentic sort of way. And here are all the reasons, and here's the data why that makes sense. But I also ended up being a really big supporter of his because of that acknowledgement. Like, he acknowledged, like, you deserved both, and we're going to find, you're right, that's not fair. Let's figure out a way to do both. And so I just love that story. And I just talked about it this week. So I think it's timely.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think sometimes the misconception, and I write about this in the book, is that we're bragging or it's ego based, right? And it could be that for some people, but it doesn't have to be a negative thing, right? Because we're all, I think to some degree, we all want to be appreciated inside the workplace or outside the workplace, right? Totally. And for me, I'm like, oh, should I even be asking for this? Or should I care about this? At least I'm getting my paycheck and all these things. But it's like, no, that makes me trust the person that I'm working for. They trust me in a sense, right? And your story reminded me of a time in my former life when I didn't feel appreciated. I didn't feel like I was the go-to person, but nobody ever acknowledged the work I was doing. I wasn't getting any salary bumps, no title changes, and I wasn't speaking up or advocating for myself in those ways. So people didn't know that I felt a way about it, right? And so I ended up having, I remember sitting at my desk like it was yesterday, and I had this recruiter. I don't know if they still call you on the phone, but they called me at my job on my line. And they told me about this really amazing position. And I hadn't thought about leaving my current job, but when they reached out to me, I realized I wasn't being appreciated. I wasn't being acknowledged for my work and with the dollars to go with it. And again, I had been at the company for maybe 9 years at that point, Deepa, and I hadn't considered leaving. I didn't think there was an option, right? And then when this person said, you need this, and at your stage, you should have this. And I'm like, oh, wow, you're right, I should, right? And so that started to let me know that acknowledgement, I mean, I knew it was important to me, but they spoke a language to me that day that pushed me to go have a conversation with my manager at the time to say, you know what, I got this offer and this is what they're offering me. And then we started doing the dance of the counter, right? And they're like, well, why didn't you come to us before if you wanted more? And I thought, you know what, some of that is on me, but it's not always on me. And so it's kind of part of the reasoning for the trust language is sometimes people don't have a magic crystal ball and know exactly what you want and what you need. And you have to articulate that. And then we can see, can I trust them with what the information that I gave? Or is this a place that's maybe no longer for me? But I think it's beneficial for both sides. Don't you agree?
I totally agree with that. I also think I love that story, and it reminds me of one of my own, because I remember a senior partner when I just joined the firm saying, like, every couple of years, it's okay to go pick your head up and go look around, like shop for a job. Not spend like months doing it, but every once in a while, just know what your value is in the external market, because in fact, it'll make you stay. And I think there's something to that. There's so many pieces we could cut that into, but I think there's something about knowing your value where you can ask for more, where you can have that conversation where it actually does make you feel more valued in the long term. And there's, higher trust. But I also think in that conversation, it's important to understand, like for me, for a long time, I wasn't chasing dollars necessarily, right? Like that wasn't always, that's not what always has motivated me in my career, to be honest with you, any of the time. So I think what I also had to understand is there's a language in the culture and the company that you're in that you also have to understand, and how they acknowledge good work and value. And you can speak different languages, but if you're just asking for pats on the back and how they value and how they acknowledge is through dollars, like you have to understand that as well. And so, I think it's a little bit of an understanding of the culture that you're in, what you want, and making known what you want in a way that is palatable. And then you can have those discussions.
I love that you highlighted that. And I think that that's part of also assessing as an individual, what language is my culture speaking, right? What, to your point, what does recognition look like? Yes. And I think this is, in this climate, people are just happy to have a job right now in many cases. And so maybe the salary increase or the merit increase isn't going to come. Right. So as leaders and managers, this is a good opportunity to send the email out and say, hey, great job on the project, right? Or maybe we can do a virtual event together, team building. Like there's ways in which we can do that. I know Gallup did some research and they surveyed 12,000 employees and they asked them about well-being. And number one on the list was employee recognition. That helps settle anxieties, like, ambiguity, having that recognition. And I'm just curious if you could just give some to the leaders out there who aren't good at speaking the language of, hey, just do your job. And if I don't tell you anything, then that's it. Right. But why is it important that we do receive that, especially at a time like this?
Yeah, I think it's so important. It's funny. I do research on this, right, on high potential individuals. And what my research has found is that most high potentials don't actually know, especially if they're women, don't actually know that they're high potential. And so without that recognition, if it's just dollars or it's just year-end feedback and they think everyone's getting that, without that acknowledgement, they don't know that there's a track for them. They don't know that there's a career for them. And a lot of them will leave. And at the exit interview, that's when the conversation happens. And they'll be told, like, you were you were on all our lists. And they had no idea, Minda. That's what's fascinating to me. So this disconnect between, yes, for everybody, but especially for this group of people you totally want to keep, that you think are your future leaders, they're halfway out the door because they don't know that they're good enough. They don't know that they belong there. They don't know that they have a career tenure there. And so that conversation is so important, especially if you don't see yourself, necessarily in that career. And so that's why I think it's not just important in the short term, but it's so important in the long term.
Absolutely. And I think especially with women or, people of color or anybody who feels like they are the only in the workplace of anything, you sometimes question your place in the organization because you're not being acknowledged for your work, right? I was one of the top performers on my last team, and I had a manager, that particular manager, I had a revolving door of managers, Deepa, but that's a whole nother book. But one particular manager, he was really good at giving acknowledgement. And because I was like, quote unquote, the rock star, I was always getting acknowledgement, right? And it also kind of put me in a weird space because it started, I think, to erode trust with others on the team because I'm the only one, right? Of course, my other colleagues are doing great work, but he was so focused on me. And, I would love to hear any thoughts you have about because acknowledgement, obviously we want to use it in a way that enhances trust, but we also want to be careful with favorites, right?
Yes.
And how that,
Yeah.
even if you are giving people praise,
Yeah.
how that what that signals to others on the team, right? I would love to dig into that.
Absolutely. I mean, because there is a lot of jealousy, right? There is a lot of back talk, or there's a lot of, they're getting special privileges, special opportunities. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. I think also, I think it's really easy to say like a high performer is the only one that needs feedback, or, is the only one that's doing a great job. But I think everyone does well in the things that they're good at. And part of your job, I think, as a good manager is to understand that not everyone's going to perform in the same exact way. And so figuring out what everyone's special magic is, right? What everyone's strengths are, and acknowledging that in a way that makes sense is so important and so powerful. And I think that's our jobs as managers. And we don't talk about that enough. I think the second thing I want to say is, we're talking about acknowledgement from top down, but I think so much of acknowledgement that's really important happens at the peer level, or also from the bottom up. So we need to find ways that acknowledgement is feedback, right? I mean, it's a different term for feedback. And yes, hopefully it's positive and it encourages you to stay, but I think it's also just a way that you're getting really good feedback, and it helps you grow, it helps you improve. It's all of those things, and that's why it's so important.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you moved on to colleagues, our peers, because sometimes we're not going to get the acknowledgement that we want from our senior leaders. But if we work on a team with people, or we do work projects together, it's easy to give somebody some acknowledgement, right? Mm-hmm. I couldn't have gotten that done without your data, right? Thank you for that. I mean, that's easy, right? That doesn't cost us anything, but it puts so much in the trust bank on the other end of that person. And I think as colleagues, because some environments are very competitive, and so we don't want to acknowledge anyone, but also acknowledgement can be, to your point, a form of feedback, because I talk about in the book where I had a very hard time with my expense reports. So
I just reread that chapter, yes.
And for those who haven't read the book, I talk about, yes, I love the praise and the acknowledgement, but I also needed acknowledgement when my work wasn't at the top tier that it needed to be, right? Let's acknowledge that there's room to improve so that I can do better to get to the place that I want to be acknowledged in the right ways, right? But part of it was I traveled like 80% of the time, and I was not very good at staying organized. So sometimes I wouldn't turn in my expense reports for like months at a time. And then I hate to say this out loud, but I read it in the book, my corporate card would get cut off. It would be all of these things, but people let me kind of just skate for like a couple years. Like nobody really talked to me about it. It wasn't a big deal. I never got wrote up for it. I'm like, oh, it's fine, whatever. And then eventually somebody came to me like after the fact and said, you know what this does, not just for you, but this impacts so many other departments when you don't do X, right? And it hit me like a ton of bricks. And that enhanced trust with me, because they acknowledged kind of a weak spot within my portfolio that I needed to do better on, right? And part of that too is, in a kind way, to not strip any way of any dignity or humanity, is also acknowledging when we have fallen short, and so that people can be accountable, right? So I know you are a manager and very high level, and I'm just wondering if you have any tips for people who have a hard time giving that acknowledgement for maybe the not so stellar things that are taking place at work.
I mean, I think it's part of your job as well. And again, by the way, I come from the place where I don't think everyone should be a manager or a mentor or a sponsor. Some people are not good at it, but in this modern day, like I think most people have to be in some form or fashion. Like the jobs, our hierarchy, like kind of demands it, and that's the tension that we see. I think you just have to give it to people straight. I think you don't code it. I think you explain, here's the issue. Some people like call it the sandwich, right? Positive, negative, positive. I always said, here's what's going on. Here's what I'm hearing. Here's the feedback. Here's the problem and why. To your point, I think you said once you learned that it was a problem for all the other departments when you were 2 or 3 months late, it really kind of clicked for you. This is not just me delaying me. This is me delaying the company. Explaining the impact of that and saying, here's what I expect to see. And I'd like to see it in the next 30 days or 60 days, or get really specific. And then checking back with that person, I think, is also part of it, right? Because people, I think sometimes when they get feedback or even positive acknowledgement, it doesn't mean that they repeat the behavior. And part of what you're trying to do is you're trying to get people to either stop the bad stuff from happening again, or really get the good stuff to happen, more than once. And so it's important to acknowledge that.
Yeah, and once I started doing better with my expense reports, I started to get the acknowledgement of great job. I felt like a kindergartner, Deepa, but great job, Minda. You were able to turn your expense reports
Yeah.
on time, right? But they acknowledged it. And I also had to acknowledge that the people in the other departments that I work with, they needed me to acknowledge that this was an issue, right? And stop pretending that this wasn't taking place. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I was eroding trust with these other departments, not intentionally, right? But I wasn't thinking about how my decisions were impacting other people. And that's where I think this trust dilemma or debacle takes place in the workplace, because sometimes we're so focused on what we're doing that we're not thinking about how these things, or how I could make your day better by just acknowledging, thanks for taking the president out last week. They really enjoyed your company. Let's talk about having you do that again, right? In a climate like this, those little touch points go a long way, right?
Yeah, well, and Aminta, I also love your story, because I think if you hadn't gotten that feedback at that point, think if you had stayed, I know you stayed for 10 years, I believe, in that role, but if you had stayed for another 5 or 6 and you got to even more senior levels and they were talking about getting you to the top, I can see a closed door conversation where people said, she's great, but I don't know how she would be with, budgeting, or I don't know how she would be with, with a large P&L because of that issue. So I think it's really important to understand that even that small feedback, that small acknowledgement can lead to conversations you don't even understand and hold you back in the future. So you're not doing anybody a service by not acknowledging them. You're not doing anybody a service by like holding back negative feedback. I think it's in how you do it. And if you do it with the right intention, right, and the right expectation, and also in order to help them, it's so important to understand that.
Absolutely. I love this conversation. The last thing that I wanted to put on the table was some people right now who are going through the book, or they're just learning about the 7 trust languages, realizing that maybe their language isn't acknowledgement, right? But just because you don't need that pat on the back, or you don't need those affirmations or honest conversations, somebody that you work with does, right? So for the person out there who's like, just do your job, why does it take all that? Maybe talk to them a little bit about how it's not about you giving somebody a gold star, but it's about building trust, building credibility with them.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in a moment, if you look at all the data and the articles are everywhere, you can just, look at today's news and it'll be there. There's such an erosion of trust across all of our institutions, and especially at work. You're seeing more and more data where bosses aren't trusting employees. I saw an article last week, and in the same way, like, we're not necessarily trusting our employers because policies have changed, or, to your point, money is tighter. There's a lot less sort of programming, right? Like just even employee programming than I've ever seen before. You and I for speaking, right? We're seeing lots of different ways that it affects people. So I think if you don't do these things, it's not only a retention tool, but you're gonna have people leave, right? For these reasons. And so I think in a market where it's especially tight, when there's great uncertainty, when everyone is highly anxious. I mean, I feel like every year when you and I talk, we're like, people are more anxious, we're even more anxious, it feels like. With all of that going on, I think it's important that you settle people. And one of the biggest things you can do to settle people is let them know how they're doing, right? And so they don't make that up in their heads. And so that's why it's important, even if it's not about pats on the back. I think it's understanding the larger context, and that there's such anxiety in the world and in employees, and that affects trust. And so a simple thing you can do, if you can't afford money or promotions or trips this year or whatever those things you used to do, if you are cutting back, that this is a different way of acknowledging that or doing that, and making people feel that you see them, you appreciate their work, that they're seen and heard. I know you and I speak that language a lot, and that they're valued, and that you need them, right? That they're part of your success. It's not just their success, it's combined success.
Absolutely. And I know for me, I value acknowledgement, so it's easy for me to speak that language to other people. But what I do realize, like you said, in this climate where we may not have promotions to give out or monetary things, what are the other things that we can do to make people feel valued? And value is tied to trust. And you mentioned something about retention. One of the stats say that $332 billion is lost on employee turnover a year, right? And so trust is good for the bottom line, right? This isn't just, again, giving people gold stars and putting their picture in the lobby and saying employee of the week, right? Maybe it is that, but it doesn't take a lot to be able to, in your next one-on-one or all staff meeting, give somebody some praise, right? Or have a conversation about ways that, like with my expense reports, how I can be more useful and helpful to my colleagues in other departments. And so I think it's so critical right now that we all speak this language. We learn how to flex that muscle and give people the recognition that they deserve, because so many people are wondering if they're going to have a job next week. And regardless if they have a job next week, at least they know that they are valued today. They're valued right now. And that just helps with that narrative in our heads, right? Because when I had that recruiter call me on the phone, Deepa, and I went to my manager to have the conversation and go through the counteroffer dance, I didn't know how valued I was until we had that conversation and what they were willing to do to try to keep me there. Why did I have to get that call from the recruiter to know that I was valued, right?
And I hear that so often. We wait until the exit to try and save the person, right? I can't tell you how many save conversations I was asked to do, and I write about this quite a bit too. But if we could have had that conversation earlier in the process and just kind of shared, not even unnatural information or have an unnatural, uncomfortable, just like, this is how we feel about you, it's great. But we wait until they're about to leave because we haven't taken the 5 minutes to do that. We could save a lot. And I think it's so important. I also think, Minda, it's like, to me, like, I've moved out of some of the traditional conversation into more of like the philosophical or the emotional conversation. So I'm doing a lot of research on worthiness, right? So much of where, good or bad, where a lot of us find our worth and our worthiness is in our jobs. And so it makes so much sense to me that people want to be acknowledged. And so we could just do that in a way that, is earlier and easier and not unnatural, but just kind of a part of what we do every month, every week, however, whatever feels right and whatever that person needs, right? To your point, it's a language. So you have to know you may need it every day. I might only need it once a month, but we need to understand that and meet people where they are.
Absolutely. And if you know that this is a language that you want your colleagues or managers or HR to speak to you, then get the book, because I have scripts in there to help you craft the conversation so that you're not like, hey, tell me more about me at work, right? But you're crafting it in a more strategic way so that they can see that this is beneficial to both parties. And, last thing I'll say about it is I have this manager and I write about him in the book too. And he always used to do these pizza parties, Deepa, and it would like drive me crazy. I'm like, we're not 16. We don't need a pizza party. But when I kind of took a step back, I realized it wasn't about the pizza party. Right?
Yeah.
It was about, this was the only way at the time that he could recognize the team. And that was his way of showing appreciation. And so whatever your pizza party needs to be, right? We need to be doing something. So final words, Deepa, on the topic of acknowledgement and trust, and then also how people can find you. Obviously, I want you to follow Deepa right here on LinkedIn, but make sure that you subscribe to her newsletter and support her work and buy her books as well.
Yeah, thank you, Minda. First, I want to say everyone should pick up your book because I do think it's important. And I think the thing that you really call out that I don't think we talk about enough is that everyone doesn't actually experience the workplace in the exact same way. And other than like the big sort of, mega topics we've been talking about for the last couple of years, it can be just in how we need to be acknowledged. It can just be in how we get feedback. It can just be in how we want to be seen in these ways. And you put such great language around it. And I think that's so important, especially right now. So I think that's part of it. Or what I want to, just acknowledge in this work, and so magical about this work. It's such an obvious sort of thing, but I don't think we put enough words to that people just need different things in the workplace. And if we could understand everyone's language and then give them what they need, which by the way, is not as hard as it sounds, right? People would be a lot happier. They'd be a lot healthier. They would be a lot more productive. And so it helps everybody if we can just do that. So I want to kind of acknowledge that. And I also just think you said, simple things like a pizza party. I remember doing research years ago, and what we found at that time was just a note, a handwritten note actually showed up on the list of 15 things we were surveying for as the most important, the most valued thing, because they felt like their boss or their leader took 10 minutes and wrote them a personal note acknowledging their year's worth of work. So it doesn't have to be, again, to your point, these big lavish things. It might just be a small sort of token of acknowledgement that's really important. So I want people to understand that it doesn't have to be these grandiose things. But yeah, I just think what you're doing is so important, especially right now, because as uncertainty increases, trust decreases. And so anything we can do to make people realize that they're valued and they're needed, and that they're humans, not just workers, and that's part of the conversation is so important.
Absolutely. And how can people find you and work with you?
DeepaPuru.com. You can find more about everything I do. Also, I post a lot on LinkedIn, so I share a lot of my thought leadership there. So that'd be a great place to start.
Definitely do that. Listen, we had a really great conversation, and I'm sure that people who could do a little bit better at speaking the language of acknowledgement. So tag them, share them. thank you for joining us today. Make sure that you get Talk to Me Nice, the 7 Trust Languages for a Better Workplace, because if we could change the way that we communicate a little bit better today, when you leave and go back into your virtual room or even in your personal life, somebody needs to be acknowledged, right? Even if they bring you that cupcake or the toothpaste that you really like, say, hey, thank you for getting that for me, right? Let's start at home, because that trickles into the workplace as well. And we have one more conversation tomorrow on transparency. So I hope that you'll be here. Again, thank you, Deepa, for always saying yes and being someone I can trust. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Go buy her book.
Awesome. Have a great day, everybody. Keep
Bye.
secure.